one of the goals of the humanities course is to teach our students to be careful writers. And I see this work that my humanities colleagues do with our students in teaching them to be articulate, succinct, really know how to structure an argument, think about who their audience might be for a particular piece that they're writing. I see the dividends of that pay out as they learn to write scientific papers. So even in freshman laboratory assignments, but then on through the sophomore and junior laboratory programs, and then into the senior thesis, I've been struck over the years, and as Nigel points out, the decades, by how well Reed students write and how seriously science students take their writing. And I will say that this will pay dividends for them throughout their scientific careers. I cannot tell you the number of journal articles I've read over the years that are badly written, and how it really hurts the communication of science. And so to me, knowing that I'm sending students, our graduates out into the scientific community as strong writers, strong written communicators, it brings me joy.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, so as a humanist, it's lovely to hear people appreciating what we do in the writing program. I'll take a step back, and I think what I love about Reed and why I've been here a quarter of a century is that everybody here really kind of works through stuff, right? There's an emphasis on wrestling with material rather than just taking it as it is, on chewing rather than gulping it down. And I think this informs a whole number of principles around how we structure the curriculum. So as Mary said, you know, we start with this large Humanities 110 class, which everybody has to take. So it's divided, and it's large in the sense that everybody takes it. But each section is 16, 17, 18 students. And in that section, you have the same professor for the full year. And as Mary said, you're focusing on what I think of as processing material. So on the one hand, writing material, writing it through, working through your ideas by writing them, understanding books by writing about them. And on the other hand, orally working through stuff. So discussion is central to these classes, right? And what these classes aren't is you know, a sequence of lectures where the point is I tell you stuff, you write it down, then I ask you if you remember it at the end of the semester, right? It's more I tell you stuff, and then when we go to class together, right? So we have these inputs, then we go to class together and we try to pull it apart. We say, well, did that make sense? If it does make sense, how did it work? Why does it work? What's interesting about it? So that we're then ready to kind of partake in that. So that's sort of at the beginning. And I would say too, you know, the introductory science classes, again, there are lectures that are inputs, but students then work through this stuff in a mix of conference discussions and lab sections, right? Where you kind of really work through the material and get to understand it from the inside rather than just being kind of passively able to reproduce it. So at the front end, right, those are the kind of introductory classes. And I'll talk about the middle in a second. But, you know, the great thing about Reed is everybody ends up doing a full year, or at least almost everyone does a full year. A few folks end up doing one semester. Senior thesis, which is an independent research project, which is really the culmination of, you know, the work in your major. So it's very rare for schools to have a compulsory thesis because it's hard to staff and it's a lot of work. At the same time, I think everybody recognizes the educational benefits of culminating an educational program with a real kind of culmination project that makes you responsible for what you do and that really does capitalize on the things you've learned, right? Whether it's you know, being able to write your argument or be able to perform your research in the various ways you do it. You know, between those two poles, right, Humanities 110 and Thesis, lots of classes in the middle. And I would say these classes are characterized by maybe two things specifically. So one is average class size at Reed is small. Average class, I think, is 17. This means that, again, classes are discussion classes, right? They're not imbibing classes. It's also incidentally helped us this term moving online, right? So you can actually have a good online discussion with 20 people. So small classes. The second thing is classes really tend to be focused around problems rather than perhaps being shaped as surveys. So one could imagine, right, sort of getting into a field, and the point is you need to know a little bit about everything in the field, right? We've made a different choice, right? Instead of saying, okay, you need coverage of everything, what we say is you need a real kind of understanding of certain kind of exemplary moments so that you can grapple in the same way, you can wrestle in the same way with problems as you develop an interest of your own and move up through the curriculum. Does that sound right, Mary?
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. Yeah. I think one important thing to say is, the thesis is the culmination of a Reed education, and we do not expect you to be ready to write a thesis when you come next August. Well, that's a really important thing to remember. I remember once a student visiting one of my introductory physics classes. It's essentially a full year. It's 2 semester courses, but students stay together in the class for a full year. And they were taking high school physics, and they were looking at the board they were visiting in April, which is toward the end of the school year. And these first year students were working these, they were working these triple integrals. So these fairly complicated mathematical entities. And the student who was visiting looked at me and said, I can't do that. I was really questioning whether Reed was the right place. And I said, they couldn't do that last April. So it's important for you to understand there's a difference between us supporting and asking of you that you be rigorous in your process, in your thought processes and in your engagement with material. The difference between us seeking that from you and us assuming that you know everything already. And so that's not the enterprise at all. The idea isn't that you come knowing everything and then we find it out by kind of opening up the box and looking inside. But rather that together, it's really a back and forth process. And we can do this again because of the small classes. It's where is this student today? And where would I like to see them be tomorrow? And so all students aren't going to enter with exactly the same writing skills. All students aren't going to enter with exactly the same mathematical background, et cetera, et cetera. And some of you will have had more opportunities, for instance, to engage in AP courses and international baccalaureate and that things. And some students have had very limited opportunities. We want you all to come. And that is exactly the project, is to help each student grow as much as that if you're ready to grow, we're ready to help you. So I think that we really have, and I've seen this change over the course of the years that I've been at Reed, but I think we really want to communicate to students that it's really not where you are today, it's where you can be tomorrow. And how do we do that together? And by together, I mean both the faculty and individual students, but also, I was going to say when Nigel was saying, classes have these components. So in the sciences, there's lecture, conference, lab. There's actually a fourth component, and that's peer-to-peer work. So I would say every physics class is really, it's lecture, it's lab, it's conference, and professors are in attendance at those things. But then there's the work you do with your peers. And that is probably the most important work that you do. And in most of the learning enterprises in which you'll be involved, that kind of collective work is encouraged. And you will teach each other more than we could ever teach you.
Yeah, so many things I just want to add to. So it's funny when you teach first year humanities at Reed, people think when they start teaching at Reed, right, that the job is going to be to get people to speak. It's not hard to get Reed students to speak. Reed students have a lot to say. What, on the whole, we all need to learn is how to actually listen and how to speak together, right? And so this process of actually working together is a really big piece of this kind of initial learning process. But I just wanted to go back to, what's really interesting about senior thesis being for everyone is that it means that it's on us to make sure that everyone will be prepared for thesis when thesis comes along, right? At schools where thesis is something that some students do, right? Typically you apply for it and you're admitted to it. The only requirement on the faculty is to choose the people who are ready to do thesis, right? They don't have to make sure everyone's ready, right? We do need to make sure everyone's ready, right? And, so on the one hand, thesis is this great way in which students get to kind of, both kind of express what they've learned and, kind of be tested on everything they've learned. But it's also a way in which we get to be tested on, whether we've actually got a curriculum that, coherently preps people for what we want them to do.
So Mary, I have a question for you, and actually both of you can answer this. It's a two-part question. How many classes or credit hours do most students take at a time? And how much time tends to be spent on the work for a class? About how many hours tend to be spent on the work for a class outside of the class relative to the number of hours inside the class. So in other words, if you have a 3-hour class, how much homework and how much outside of the class work hours do you have for that particular course?
So the first thing I'd say, and I say this to all of my freshman advisees, is this is really different than high school. So in high school, it's not uncommon for students to take 7, 8, 9 classes. Then by definition, each of those classes is in some ways, it's asking of you 1/7 of your time, or 1/8 or 1/9 of your study time. So Reed classes are going to be much more, each class is going to ask much more of you than any one high school class ever asked of you. And so one needs 30 units to graduate. So that would be 7 semester courses for 2 of your years and 8 semester courses for 2 of your years. That's, if you don't transfer in any credits. So for usually for first semester students, I encourage them to take 3 classes, and there are a few half-unit classes, and maybe add a half-unit class. And then many students look at me and say, 3 classes? Well, what am I going to do with all my time? And so I assure them that, if they take physics and calculus and humanities 110, they're going to have absolutely plenty to do academically. They're not going to be bored, and they're going to be working. They're going to be working pretty hard. Nigel, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say humanities is 1.5, 1.5.
Right.
So math, physics, humanities is actually 3.5 for the year. So that would be 7, which would be a classic first year, right? 7, 8, 8, 7, as Mary said, very normal. In terms of the number of hours, I would say, in lab class is a little different, but sort of a classic sort of humanities or social science class would meet for 3 hours a week. And prep time, I think we, as professors, what we plan for would be 3 to 4 times that.
Yeah, so that, and I often, tell the science students, in like a class like introductory physics, there's 3 hours of lecture, an hour and a half of conference, and there's 3 hours of lab. So that's 7.5 hours before you've opened a book. So it's going to be at least that again when you do open the books. So, you know, it's probably somewhere between a 12 and 15-hour commitment, and that's one class. So, so 3 classes really, really not, is pretty realistic, I think, for your first semester. And then, you know, my advisees sometimes are surprised to hear me say this, but I say, and you got to make some friends, you know, you have other things to do. And we actually want you to do those things.
Right. And those
question
things
here, and I'm actually going to answer this because our guest who asked the question has to run off in just a bit, so I thought I'd sneak this in here. Will I lose my spot at Reed if I take a gap year for COVID-19 reasons? I'm not interested in a virtual experience. So this is a great question, something we've talked a lot about this week. Right now, our plan is to start class in person come this fall. We continue to talk about this on a daily basis. In fact, we have a group of staff that meet every day to talk about COVID-19 related issues. So much like this is an experience for you on a daily basis, it's something that we're thinking about for you also on a daily basis. But what we're keeping, I shouldn't say but, what we're keeping at the center of our priority is number one, to keep our students safe, and that includes our future students in addition to our current students, and also to ensure that the quality of the program does not diminish. And we've committed to let families know that if anything does change, if that plan does adjust, we will let you know as soon as possible. And we're hoping to let folks know the date by which we'll make that decision. Folks may continue to defer using our regular deferral guidelines. That's with some sort of academically oriented program over the course of both semesters for the following year. So we tend to approve about half of our defer request. The exceptions in a case where we may not accept a defer is for someone who says, oh, I'm going to hang out for a year, I might bike back in Europe. It does have to be a program that has some type of curriculum. And our admission staff, your admission counselor, would be really good about helping you determine that. But that's our plan, and there are different ways that plan can happen. And we'll know as soon as you know. As we all realize, we're creating infrastructure as we're moving along. We're creating the bridge as we walk across it. But we're really committed to making sure that experience is great for you. And that's what we know today. And as those situations change, we've been really great about communicating with you. You've received the email messages. We'll certainly keep you informed. Another question for Nigel and Mary. I'm actually going to combine 2 things, and we have maybe give us about 5 minutes to talk about these 2 questions. How does the grading process work at Reed? And I think this is also a good time to talk about the paper conference, because part of the reasons we do the paper conference the way we do is because we don't just give because of the way we grade. So I'll let you both speak about that.
You want to go first, Nigel, on that one?
Sure. Yeah. You know, the general principle about Reed, right? I mean, the fact is we take grades very seriously, but we focus our interaction between you and me, between students and teachers, on improvement. So the goal is less to say, okay, I've reached a certain level, I'm done, than whatever level you've reached to go further, right? So typically, you know, what will happen is the feedback you will get will not be of the kind of single letter variety, like B, A, whatever it is, right? But in fact, it'll be kind of, you know, comments and a kind of description of where you've been and where you need to go. So I don't know if I mentioned before, but I'm teaching in the humanities program right now. And what we do there is, you know, there's a certain number of papers. And after each paper, we write out our comments. And as I say, you know, typical shape for a comment is, you know, well, what we were working on, what I asked you to work on for this paper was the following things. These, you know, you did actually master these in various ways, or you mastered some of them and I need you to work on the others. And then you add in some other things to work on for the next one. And then you kind of pick that up as a kind of program running through the semester. But then you actually meet with each student to go over the paper. So you sort of talk through those comments and you know, make sure that in some sense your kind of understanding of what went on in the paper is accurate, but also make sure the student understands what you're looking for, and you can talk about strategies that are going to work for you. There are a lot of different ways one might get to a particular endpoint. But I think this means that, as Mary said at the beginning, I think the writing program is particularly successful because we take people from where they are to, wherever they need to go, right? Rather than having a sort of, one size fits all version.
Yeah, and I think the grading in the science classes is a little bit more conventional. So, you will, in a physics class or math class, you'll do problem sets, and the feedback on your problem sets might include a numerical score. But still, we try very hard to include narrative comments even on problem sets. So if a student has done work on the problem, but then something's off and they didn't get to the right conclusion, it's really important that they understand exactly where things went wrong. I mean, it's one thing to drop a factor of 2, and it's another thing to really have a conceptual, conceptual error that it's very important to point out, so that as you move forward, you're no longer under that conceptual misconception. So we try to actually not just give you a grade, but actually grade your work, so that we're helping you identify exactly where things went right or things went wrong. And then the laboratory program, and it's going to vary from class to class, but for instance, in the physics program, we also have paper conferences in the sophomore lab program, because that's where we're really trying to teach you to write a research style report reminiscent of a scientific paper. And so in that, we have students write their very first laboratory report, and then actually have a Hume style paper conference with them. So, and again, as Nigel said, these are the things that you've done very well, and these are the things we want you to work on. And here's, and then of course, it's iterative. It's not that you do something and then and then your professor gives you some comments about where to go, and you just nail it the next time. It's the process is iterative. So, it's important also not to be too hard on yourself, because I think one thing that maybe the faculty doesn't communicate as well as we should is that we can always give you more constructive criticism. And that's how you get better and better. But sometimes I think students can feel like there's nothing I can do where it comes back without some constructive comments. And that's us, we think, doing our job really well. And we don't want you to misinterpret that I can never get it right, because you're right. You will never get back a paper that just says, this is perfect. Because when we talk to each other about our work, we don't do that. There isn't anything that couldn't be improved. And so, when I give my colleagues papers to read for me before I send them to reviewers, I say, be as hard as you can on this, because that's what's going to do me good. It's not going to do me good for you to read it and say, yeah, I like that, fine.
I think this is really important. It's another one of these things like full, compulsory senior thesis, right? Which holds everybody's feet to the fire, right? So if your commentary has to be focused on improvement, right? You can't kind of engage in, to some extent, this sort of Faustian bargain, which is a kind of let off for the institution, right? If you just kind of give a letter grade and it's a high letter grade and it's not focused on anything that needs to be done, then on some level, everybody's happy, but nobody's growing, right? What Mary talked about, right? Of course, nobody's ready to write a thesis when they come in. Why would they be? But one does need to grow to get there, right? And that means one needs to improve and one needs to learn things. And that's only going to happen if that's the kind of direction of the way one is working and of that relationship with your professors.
Excellent. So two questions I'll answer quickly, and then I'll ask you all another question. The first, will taking credits from another institution over the summer change my application status? It will if you take courses at a credit-bearing school, say that it's a local community college or a four-year college, and you enroll in order to take that class. You are then considered a transfer student, and that's actually a different enrollment process. That's not just true for Reed, it's true for many schools. And so, and that's also the case that if you defer. So one of the activities that you must do over that time can't actually include enrolling at another university, because then you actually have to transfer back to Reed. Most of that has to do with eligibility. It has to do with financial aid. It has to do with how terms are tracked. However, some folks do want to engage in certain educational activities to stay sharp over the summer, and we can talk you through that. That's not to say that you can't take advantage of these opportunities, but we want to make sure that you don't unintentionally negatively impact your enrollment status. The second question, are there any changes in place for the application for rising seniors? There are. Next year, Reed will be accepting self-reported test scores, much like many of you did self-reported transcripts for schools this year. We know that most of the juniors, even though tests have been canceled, have actually taken some of the standardized tests. I think many of you are aware that many schools have waived altogether, either indefinitely or temporarily the ACT or the SAT. I'll tell you, and many of you know this, Reed is simply different when it comes to college admission. We don't participate in US News and World Report, which also means that if there are students who we want to admit, we can admit them. We're not limited to a student having a certain test score, a certain ACT score. We look for talent, we look for skills, and we look for students who have performed well. And the most important piece of our evaluation process has always been your high school transcript, and that will continue to be true. We do, however, think it may be a barrier for students to actually submit the test and turn in an official test score because of costs. And that we found that in particular this year tended to be a barrier. So you are actually the first folks to learn this, but soon rising seniors will all be aware of that. So that's probably the most significant change in terms of the application process for the upcoming year. Mary and Nigel, are majority of the classes year-long? Are they for a semester? Is there a reason why one might be year-long and another course might be for a semester? And are they offered every year?
That's a difficult question. So the first one's an easy question. The vast majority of the classes are single semester classes. There are a few classes that are year-long. I think they are the first year humanities class and introductory language classes. And I think that's it now. There was a time 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when most classes were year-long classes. But the vast majority are single semester. Why do we have year-long classes? Well, we have year-long classes when they're actually a kind of coherent unit, right? So introductory French, you know, you kind of work through French in a year, right? That's the point of it. Do both semesters. You get through all the syntax and the grammar. Your vocab won't be huge, but you will have got through all the syntax and the grammar. Humanities 110, it's a coherent writing program for the year, right? You do really see a kind of growth across the full year that you would be denied in a single semester. The second question was, are classes repeated every year? Well, no. Introductory classes are repeated every year. And probably secondary level classes, the next up. But beyond that, I think the 300 level classes in a lot of majors tend to cycle on a 2 or 3 year cycle. You know, they're all doing the same kind of functions. It's not like, you know, if you enroll in the wrong year, you're going to get to your junior year and there's nothing you can take to sort of fulfill your major. But you'll just be doing different classes, right, to what you might do in the following year. Or, and that keeps it fresh and interesting and gives you different options when you're a senior as well.
Yeah, and I think this varies a bit from major to major. So, for instance, in a lot of the science and in the science curriculum, there are core classes through the junior year in some of the majors, and so so for instance, in physics, there's a core curriculum that goes through the junior year. So freshmen take the 100 level core courses, sophomores take the 200 level core courses, juniors take the 300 level core courses. Those courses are offered every year. So it would never, if you're in a hierarchical sequence, and so you need a particular course in your sophomore year to go on to the junior level courses, that sophomore course would always be offered. Mm-hmm. Now, as Nigel was saying, in many majors, including some of the STEM majors, it's basically by, say, the junior year, the upper division year, they're trying to teach you modes of thought, modes of inquiry, styles of research, various tools of the trade, if you will, and that you can learn those tools of the trade with varying subject matter. So the course that you take might differ from year to year, and the professor might differ from year to year, but what the department as a whole has thought through, what skills do students need at each level, and in some majors you can get those skills across a number of courses, and in other majors it's very specific to a specific course. So
yeah,
that's a really long way of saying, right, if there's anything you need to continue in the major, that thing's going to be offered every year.
One of the nice things about these classes that rotate, which we often call elective classes, even if you have to take some of them, is that we have a really research active faculty, and often these classes will be in areas that the faculty members are really kind of active in national and international conversations, and so the class kind of exists at a kind of a cutting edge area where many classes just won't quite be there yet, right? So you'll have access to these kinds of classes by virtue of the fact that the focus is, as Mary says, more on kind of modes and moments and problems rather than survey.
Nigel, I sent you a couple of questions. Do you think you can address some of those?
So I'll read them out because I'm assuming other people don't see these. So the questions are about how did Reed faculty find switching to remote learning this term? What might the lessons be from that going forward? Might this be something we would take away? So we shifted to online learning after spring break. A few faculty members who are older or immunocompromised made the shift in the prior week or the week before that. I think, the interesting thing is, I think, I guess if I say it myself, I think faculty have done a terrific job online. We have a very strong IT operation here. So, some basic things.
Explain what IT is.
Information technology, I'm sorry. So, basic things like bandwidth and so on campus are very good. There's a lot of, screens and processing power and so on. So we had a good infrastructure. And the faculty really embraced, what we had to do. My understanding is the vast majority of classes went to synchronous video conferencing. So the main platform we used is the one you're on right now, is Zoom. I think there's a few Google Meets out there, but pretty much Zoom was the platform that people preferred. We were able to kind of keep the structure of the curriculum where it was and have people meet together synchronously, and with some asynchronous options for maybe folks who live in a very different time zone or found their lives more complicated when they got when they got home. I do know, Humanities 110 is going great, actually. I meet twice a week for an hour and a half each time. And, students are attending really well, and almost all of them speak every day. They have a nice kind of rapport. Sometimes, depending on how I want to work the class, sometimes the class sort of goes through me, and sometimes it goes through each other. But the Zoom software has worked really well. I think there are elements that are, I think, tiring of sort of sitting in front of the screen. But equally, as Mary says, right, a lot of one's prep time is a lot of one's time in the week is prep time. So I find my students sort of, quite sort of raring to go when class starts. I think they're all pleased to see each other. I think what is hard is students miss each other, right? They're not hanging out. So the other piece of the question, what have we learned going forward? I think there are several pieces of this. One is, there are, our preference is always going to be in person. I think we've learned, though, for things like troubleshooting, small classes really are helpful, right? It was much easier to move small classes online, much easier to keep people involved and interested online when the classes are small, when people have a sense of themselves as kind of individuals and actually being part of a conversation. This is maybe a small thing, but Humanities 110 has 3 lectures in addition to this conference time, right? And the lectures are Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 a.m. And we've put those lectures into podcasts. And I would say that I think my students are engaging with them more fully now that they're in podcasts and not at 9 a.m. That might be something we might want to do.
Excellent. I'm just going to make a quick point of clarification. I spoke a little bit about transfer credit. I want to clarify that was transfer credit after students have graduated who enroll at a college or university. It does not include transfer courses that you take while you're in high school at a local community college, post-secondary or dual credit programs. And so there is a differentiation there. We have a great question, and I'm actually going to ask you both, not maybe to take turns, but volunteer both of you to answer this, because it's involving the changes in the Hum 110 curriculum. If you can discuss those changes, the impact of those changes, the response from the community for those changes to our curriculum. So perhaps what our curriculum for Hum 10, what it was, what it is now, in that transition.
Yeah, I'll do that. I also see somebody says, would it be possible to get access to one of the podcasts? I'm pretty sure, do we have that, Millian?
Yeah, so we've got access to classes. You can also request a class online, and a few of our faculty members have actually made their senior thesising courses available. So reach out to the admission office and we can put you in touch.
But Hum podcast specifically, I'm pretty sure, we asked a bunch of folks and a bunch of folks were like, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the thing to remember when you see that, I think there's some really cracking lectures actually up on the podcast. But that's what you're seeing, right? You're seeing the lecture. And even a good lecture, that's not representative of what we're doing in Hum, right? That's one of the inputs that we then chew over in the conference. And I don't know if we've got recordings of conferences up there. I suspect we don't, because there are all sorts of privacy issues around. You need everyone's permission and so on. So when you look at the podcast, remember that, what Hum isn't is just a sequence of lectures, right? What Hum is a bunch of different inputs, right? Which include the readings, some of which are primary readings, right? You might read a novel, you might read an essay on the novel, and then you might listen to a lecture on the novel, right? And then you talk about all 3 of those, right? You sort of work through the novel, through the lecture, through the readings, and really try to kind of understand both the work itself and the concepts used for kind of unpacking it. I love teaching in Hum 110. When I started, so back back whenever, mid-90s. Hum 110 was fundamentally an ancient Mediterranean class. So, and I'm a classicist, right, which means I do Greece and Rome, I do Greek athletics particularly. We did Greece, Rome, we did the sort of ancient Near East, particularly biblical materials as well. And I think in many ways that was a great class, right? Over time, I think we felt it was limiting in certain ways. And now we do we're in a new syllabus, we're in the second year of a syllabus. And in the fall, we do a kind of version of the ancient Mediterranean class. We do Greece and Egypt, Persia, so that includes biblical materials too. And then in the spring, we do half the semester on Mexico, from the kind of right before the colonial period, through the colonial period, into the 20th century. And then we do roughly a kind of Harlem Renaissance module. I mean, broadly understood. So, roughly that's Harlem between the wars, especially kind of African-American artistic culture. But it ranges more broadly than that. So there's a lot on kind of how, what influences are playing into that, and also kind of how it plays out in certain ways. So, well, today conference was on Their Eyes Are Watching God, which some of you may know, but Zora Neale Hurston, I think one of the great American books of the 20th century, actually, by a scholar who was actually a PhD candidate in anthropology, and kind of merges her kind of anthropological expertise with a truly kind of novelistic eye. Beautiful, fascinating, powerful stuff. And going back to the biographical, right? I'm not an Americanist, but I'm loving teaching this stuff. Part of what we do in Hume, right? There are 25 of us teach this program, people from different humanistic fields and different periods. And, at different points in the year, we have more or less expertise in the stuff that's under discussion. But the basic point is we kind of work through this stuff with you, right? That we get to come at it with a certain kind of newness, in imitation of kind of what you're doing too, right? So this really kind of militates against a classroom where kind of this happens. I tell you what to think, and you then write it down, right? Much more, we go into it together, and I say, well, this is what I thought, and you say this is what you thought, and we kind of work through them and decide what makes more sense, and how we make those decisions, and so on. And I love that process of kind of group work, and I love the freedom that Humanities 110 brings, right? So when I think to myself, okay, what do I want from my students this term? It's really to kind of learn how to handle a variety of concepts by the end of the semester. Those concepts, I have some idea what they're going to be, but it depends a bit what comes up in the lectures, and I'll shift around. It depends on what the conference is interested in. But what doesn't happen is that every day I sort of think, oh, I've got 5 things. And then suddenly we've talked about one for an hour and a half, and we haven't done the other 4, and so I have to take the next class to run through them. I've got much more flexibility than that, right? We sort of work through things, and when we're exploring it fruitfully, we stick with it. And it's really a great pleasure to teach in that class. Was that actually the question?
I think you covered it. We are about at the end of our time. I'm going to answer a question quickly. Is Hume 110 required for sophomore transfer students? It really depends on the credits that you're bringing in after your transcript evaluation. But most of our sophomore transfer students do take Hume 110. They'll join in with the first year student. Those that don't, there is another program that has very similar tenets. That's really the second year for Hume 110. Yes, you can capture that opportunity as a transfer student.
Millian, I might just make one more comment, because I wasn't sure that the emphasis was great enough. So as you all know, we're living through an extraordinary historic moment right now, and none of us know exactly what's going to happen in 2 weeks, in a month, in 2 months, etc. But rest assured that our preference for educating, we're committed to residential liberal arts education. And so our vast preference is for our students to be here together, living and learning. And within the confines, of course, of state and federal guidelines and keeping people safe and doing what's in absolutely everyone's best interest, that is our goal. So we're not the least bit interested in becoming an online educational institution. You know, I'm looking at you all on little screens, but I so much rather see you on campus. Because what I don't get to see here, and what I do get to see on campus, is to get to see you with each other. And that actually is the most remarkable thing to see, is even for faculty, is when students bond with each other, both in terms of their intellectual growth and in terms of their friendships. So rest assured, that's our preference. That's where we hope to be.
Thank you, Mary. Well said. I appreciate you saying that. I'm going to give you both the last word. Both of you are in a unique position, having taught at Reed, having seen how this education is transformative and perhaps different from other schools. Both of you are long-time Portland residents. Both of you have had students that have made this difficult decision of selecting a college. Nigel, not too long ago for you. So those are three things. I would like you to either give parting thoughts about the distinctiveness of Reed, or what it's like to live and exist in Portland, or if you have really great advice for them making a college decision. You don't have to pick all three, but I'd love for you to pick at least one of those to share some advice for our students.
Well, when you first said that, my first thought was, I've been asked many times over the years, and I've been asked in the presence of other faculty members, you know, so for instance, by a job candidate for a faculty position, or a job candidate for a staff or administrative position. Why are you at Reed? And I remember once we were asked, two faculty members, we were interviewing a future member of the staff, and that person asked us, why are you at Reed? And we said, in sync, we said, oh, because of the students. So Reed students are the reason to teach at Reed. You are amazingly engaged and exciting, and there's no better place to teach. You know, so students go to some schools because they have a great football team, or they have great frats, or whatever. Students come to Reed to be students, first and foremost. And nothing could be more exciting for a faculty member. So, so that's my take on the first one. Portland's an amazing city. It's got, basically the way I describe it to other people, it's got everything, but you don't have to drive forever to get there. You know, whatever kind of food you want, whatever kind of music you want, whatever kind of theater you want, it's all here, and it's probably a 15-minute bus ride away. And in the last one, yes, both Nigel and I have college-age kids, and so I would say, and I've heard Million say this. Million says, my job isn't to get students to go to Reed. My job is to make sure that every student with which I interact goes to the right school for them. So we want you to know as much about Reed by May 1st as you make your decisions, but we want you to come to Reed if Reed's the right school for you.
Yeah, for me, you know, I mentioned, so my research activities really around Greek athletics, and Greeks were obsessed when they thought about athletics, and they drew pictures of it. They drew pictures of wrestlers. This was their kind of fundamental idea of like, what's a classic athletic activity? Well, it's wrestling, right? And for me, this is actually, you know, it's my classic metaphor for Reed. What I love about Reed is the wrestling, right? Students wrestle with ideas, and they also wrestle with your ideas, right? You don't get to just like throw stuff out and everybody sort of genuflects in your direction. It's like people are always kind of wrestling with you, and that's like really fun. It's just class is really enjoyable here, and you know, like I talked earlier about how, you know, I think we do a really good job with student growth, but I like to think we do a good job with faculty growth too, that the classes I teach now are not the classes I taught 5 years ago. They're not the classes I taught 10 years ago. We're all sort of on our toes here. And there's a way in which that's, you know, that's tiring sometimes, right? Reed is in some ways not an easy life, but it's a really satisfying life. You're on mute, Milliam.
Thank you. I want to thank our guests for joining us. I know for many of you, it's later than it is here out on the West Coast. So thank you for staying up to hang out with us. Thank you for the contribution of your wonderful questions. I want to thank Mary and Nigel for joining us today. I want to invite all of you to continue to come back and ask your questions. There's no reason for anyone to walk away not having all the information that is possible to provide to not get that information. So your admission counselor is ready to help support you in that endeavor, or to connect you with the information that you need. I'm really excited to work with you juniors who've joined us today. So you have a preview of a few of our, one of our really special events. But I wish all of you to have a really great evening, and thanks for hanging out. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Good to see you.